live in a vast sea of energy. Everything, every atom, every subatomic particle is in constant motion, spinning eternally. Even in the cold, dark, absolute vacuum of empty space, there exists what new physics is calling the quantum vacuum flux. It is the ether of the ancients, the life force energy of metaphysics, are the random fluctuations of this vast field of potential in which space and time are embedded. Now, theoretically and mathematically proven, the question no longer is, does this zero-point energy exist? But rather, can we tap this inexhaustible resource of free and unlimited energy and manifest new technologies which are both inexpensive and environmentally safe? Emerging on the frontiers of science, a pioneering breed of theoretical physicists and inspired inventors are challenging the way we think about harnessing the unseen forces of nature. Despite ridicule, lack of funding, and outright suppression, they are confronting an outmoded classical worldview and ushering in a monumental scientific revolution.
All the way through this investigation, it was clear to me that if you understood the structure of the vacuum, the structure of the foundation of creation, you could reproduce it in a technology. As I looked at the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible, the Ark that they call the Ark of God, they give dimensions of that box. It's like a box-like object that's got gold on the outside, wood in the middle, and gold on the inside.
The book of Exodus in the Bible is very clear on how to build the Ark of the Covenant. The box had to be made of hard chitim wood, or acacia as it's known today, 45 inches long, 27 inches wide, and 27 inches deep, and then lined inside and out with pure gold. A solid gold mercy seat, or lid, was to be placed on top of the ark, upon which perched 2 gold winged cherubs facing each other with their wings spread. 2 wooden carrying poles were then passed through gold rings on either side of the box to allow it to be carried safely. But the Bible also says the ark erupted in a shower of sparks and flames, killing those who touched it and laying waste armies. Clearly this was no ordinary carrying chest. But why was the ark so deadly? Highly controversial theories suggest that it might have contained particles from a meteorite. Others speculate that it was a nuclear device of some sort, made of highly radioactive uranium. John Hutchison's belief is no less controversial, but much more practical. John Hutchison is a maverick scientist, specializing in electromagnetic currents, and has been fascinated by the ark for as long as he can remember. In the 1980s, he pioneered a project to investigate the effects of intense electromagnetic electricity on different materials. The results were surprising, with reports of metal discs levitating off laboratory tables, wooden planks fusing together with metal rods, solid metal balls liquefying, and heavy apparatus lifting off the floor. The experiments became known as the Hutchison effect. Although controversy still surrounds his work in this field, there are many scientists who have validated Hutchison's pioneering research. He believes that it might have been a high-voltage capacitor, part of some lost, ancient technology. According to his theory, when it was carried across the hot desert, the 2 gold cherubs on top of the box collected huge amounts of static and electromagnetic electricity, causing the entire outside of the ark to be negatively charged. With the hard acacia wood acting as an insulator between them, the inside of the box, also gold-lined, would have become positively charged and would have been able to build up and store a lethal voltage, zapping anyone who touched it. If this theory is true, then 3,000 years ago, this would have indeed seemed like God in a box.
Well, that's a capacitor. A capacitor is an object that holds energy. When you charge it, just like a battery, it holds energy, except that a battery can only discharge the energy very slowly. A capacitor can discharge the energy in an instant. So when I looked at it, I thought, well, that's a neat capacitor. It would be quite large in capacitance. It would be a very high level, a lot of capacitance. It would have really high voltage. And it would be quite heavy. It would be a heavy object, extremely heavy. In fact, it would be way too heavy to lift up with two flimsy poles. It would weigh over 3 tons because of all the gold on it. And then I noticed that those boxes were the exact appropriate boxes to fit inside the sarcophagus inside the Grand Pyramid of Giza. Meaning that the box size is a perfect fit so that you can lower the ark inside the sarcophagus, inside the Grand Pyramid, and then push the poles in without having to touch the capacitor, which would zap the crap out of it.
Strange World of John. The ancient Egyptians were using voltaics and different metals and also possibly electrostatics. And I think they even had crude light bulbs from what I'm told.
Johns built a scale model of the ark using the same acacia wood, but 2 brass eagles instead of angels. He's attached the box to a powerful transformer to test how it will react to a high voltage charge. Even here, the dangers are very real.
I've heard a story 30 years ago from a radio broadcaster where they built a replica of the ark in a university, and this thing actually electrocuted somebody, and the project was shelved because it was too dangerous. The cherubim, with their wings outstretched over the mercy seat, act as spark gaps, really, because they're so close together, which means that they could carry a spark right across them and cause a glow effect to come down onto the highly polished gold mercy seat, and you'd see all this magical light in that, like a mirror.
One of the more controversial theories on the Great Pyramid at Giza is that it was an energy source built at a specific location to harness a strong, natural electromagnetic field, like other ancient sites such as Glastonbury and Machu Picchu. According to these theories, the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid functioned like a huge capacitor and stored this charge, causing those inside to have out-of-body experiences. Could this really be true? I had to find out for myself.
What I find the most intriguing about the king's chamber is this basin here. It's made out of quartz and granite, and it's the same cubic capacity as the Ark of the Covenant. 45 inches long, 27 inches wide, and 27 inches deep. What was it used for? Could it have been that the Ark of the Covenant was placed in here, and that's how the pyramid came to life?
So it was a perfect fit. And I started to think, what would you want to carry in a capacitor like that? There must have been some extremely powerful energy source, energy device inside that capacitor. But in any case, Moses is taking 40 years to do a route that should have taken a year. Why? Because he's following the ark. It's very clear in the Judaic tradition and in the rabbinic tradition that the ark is moving on its own. Whenever the ark lifts and starts going, they would lift camp and follow it. And whenever the ark would stop, they would stop and put a camp up. Sometimes they would stay there for 3-4 years before the ark would start going again. So this ark seemed to have anti-gravitic capability. It seemed to be able to hover. There's instances where they describe the ark lifting the high priest that carried it. So I'm thinking about all this, and then eventually, you know, Moses dies, and Joshua has taken the lead. And Joshua arrives at the Jordan. And this is where I found this really interesting thing. Joshua arrives at the Jordan, and the Jordan is running at flood level. There's no way they can cross with the tribes of Israel. They're trying to get to Jericho on the other side. Now, this is describing the high priest taking the ark and going into the water of the Jordan with the ark. And as soon as they put their feet in the Jordan with the ark, the waters are cut off. Okay? And then it says, you know, and then there's a whole bunch of other things. This is Joshua 4:22 for people that want to refer it. And the priests came up out of the river, carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner they had set their feet on dry ground than the water of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. So they went into the Jordan, sat there with the ark, while all of the tribes of Israel went across, and the water was stopped. And then as soon as they got out, the water started to flow again. Well, I thought that's interesting, because one evidence of gravitational effect would be to stop the course of water. But what blew my mind is what comes next, at the end of that chapter. For the Lord your God, they're talking about the ark, dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what had been done to the Red Sea when he dried up before us, when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. Wow. That has been omitted. Because this says that they used the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to open the Red Sea with Moses. But in the section where they talk about opening the Red Sea, they just say Moses lift up his staff and open his arm, and the Red Sea opened. They forgot to mention that the ark was involved with this staff. And so here they do, though. Here they make it very obvious that the power of the ark was used to open the Red Sea. That means the ark was not the box that was built at the foot of Mount Sinai after opening the Red Sea. The power of the ark had to be there with Moses before he crossed the Red Sea. And thus it was something else. And when we see the evolution of the ark, we find that the ark had gone through a long chain of events that brought the knowledge all over the world. When the high priest had the ark in the Temple of Solomon, they knew that if Jerusalem was attacked, they would have to take the ark out of Jerusalem somewhere. So they had a B plan, obviously, for the ark in case there was something to happen with the Temple of Solomon. The Temple of Solomon was built as concentric walls with the Holy of Holies in the middle. These walls were extremely thick, and they were to protect the initiate from the Ark of the Covenant. The initiate had go through all sorts of initiation to eventually go from one wall to the other to get to the Holy of Holies. It was the largest temple ever built on earth. But during the 1st century AD, the Philistines took over Jerusalem. There was a B plan for the ark. That B plan was called Essenes. So when they took the ark out of the Temple of Solomon, they brought it to the Essene, which was a community of high priests that was constantly being made ready in case the ark would show up. In the Essene scrolls that were found, you know that there was over 5,000 scrolls, or at least 3,000, scrolls that were found. There's only 100 that have been released to the public. One of these that was released to the public is a very, very eccentric scroll. It's not written on papyrus. It's written on copper. The copper that it's written on is the purest copper ever found on earth. What does the copper scroll? Now, obviously, the copper scroll were written on copper to make sure they would survive the ages. And what did the copper scrolls talk about? It talked about the coming of the ark at the Essene community. Much later, it seems like there was a Jewish contingency in France that believed that they were the direct descendant of Emmanuel, the Cathars. They were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. They started an order of knights to look for the Ark. That order was called the Knights Templar. Well, after years of research and so on, they came to conclude that the ark had to be in Jerusalem somewhere, under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They were there and they occupied Jerusalem for many years. For 7 of those years, the Knights Templar themselves settled right beside the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and dug and dug and dug tunnels that are still there today. They're not accessible. You can't go there. They're blocked and they're heavily guarded. In any case, the Knights Templar dug for 7 years and found zilch. Well, they found a lot of documents, and that's in history books, but they didn't find the ark. It just happens that while they were there digging, the king of Ethiopia was in exile. There was a revolution in Ethiopia and was brought in exile to Jerusalem. And when he heard the Knights Templars were looking for the ark, he went to them and said, "I have the ark. It's in Ethiopia." And there, in Ethiopia, you find ancient traditions that talk about blonde hair, blue-eyed people, Europeans, coming during those years, liberating the country, and building all sorts of things. Now, when you find these things they built, you know they didn't build this with conventional means. Because when you find the things they built in Ethiopia, you find that those are churches. One of them is a church that's a big Knights Templar cross type of structure that is not built, actually it's cut into the stone, like laser cut into the stone, and then it's cut inside it and then emptied out. This huge chapel, right? Basically cut, like sculpted right out of the stone. Only one person has been able to interview the guardian of the ark today. One priest in Ethiopia is chosen to guard the ark, and he has to be pure of heart. And when he's chosen to guard the ark, he never leaves the chapel where the ark is. From that moment on, he stays there for the rest of his life. That high priest gave one interview, and he gave it to Graham Hancock, and it's in the book, The Sign and the Seal.
As a correspondent based in Nairobi in Kenya during the early 80s, I frequently visited Ethiopia. It was on my beat. It was a place I went to very, very, very regularly. And during visits as a reporter to Ethiopia, I came across the extraordinary, seemingly extraordinary claim that the Ethiopians make to have possession of the lost Ark of the Covenant. The Ark itself, as in Indiana Jones' Raider of the Lost Ark.
Now, people who don't know, this is mentioned in the Bible. It's supposedly a sarcophagus or something.
Well, a wooden box. It's very clearly specified in the Book of Exodus. It's a box which consists of gold and wood. So there's an outer box of gold. Inside it a box of wood. Inside that another box of gold. I'll just mention in passing that gold is a superb radiation shield.
Right.
And the whole aura that surrounds this box in the Old Testament is of a dangerous and deadly object.
If you touch it, you can be fried by it.
If you touch it, you die.
Yeah.
There are many accounts of people being struck dead by bolts of fire shooting out from the ark. Now, what the Bible tells us was in the ark was the 2 tablets of stone, upon which the 10 Commandments were written by the finger of God Himself.
Okay.
And so they were seen as the energy source of the ark, which were divine, supernatural, which sent out these bolts of fire and allowed the ark to lift up into the air. There are many accounts in and out of the Bible of the ark being used in battle, of the Israelites carrying it into battle, of it lifting its bearers off the ground, charging towards the enemies of Israel. There's an account where the Philistines briefly steal the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites. They seem not to know how to handle it. They open its lid, and then within days they're all dying. Tens of thousands of them die. They file past it. They look at it like a tourist object, and tens of thousands of them die. And the Bible states that they died of cancerous tumors.
Consistent with radiation poisoning.
It sounds like radiation poisoning. So all these things intrigued me, and especially so when I went to Ethiopia and went to the sacred city of Aksum in northern Ethiopia during a time when Ethiopia was locked in a deadly civil war.
Okay.
And this town was in a very hotly contested zone. It was extremely difficult to get into. And I found myself in the presence of a monk who was the guardian, claimed to be the guardian of the Ark of the Covenant. He sat out in the grounds of a little chapel annexed to an ancient cathedral, Christian cathedral, called the Cathedral of St. Mary of Zion. And he said, yes, the Ark of the Covenant is in there.
Now, what's the conventional view is that it either is a myth or that it has gotten lost or something,
well,
right? Nobody knows where it is.
Let me just come to that first. What
Okay.
really tweaked my attention, because remember those accounts in the Bible of how the ark strikes people dead and,
Right.
and causes cancerous tumors. Well, these guys, the guardian of the ark, once he's appointed as guardian, he must stay as guardian for the rest of his life.
Oh my
But
gosh.
what I found, and he can never leave the grounds of that little chapel. But
Wow.
what I discovered was, because over a series of visits, I met a series of these individuals because they had very short lives. And over just 2 years, two of them died, and I again went and met the third one.
That's amazing.
And he had developed cataracts over his eyes. And I said, why? What's happening to your eyes? Because I'd noticed that previous ones had that problem as well. He said, the ark is doing it to me. And I said, why? What is the ark doing to you? And he just said, he looked at me very, very level, and he just said, the ark is a thing of fire. And I knew that he was telling the truth, that there was something in there that scared him, and that at the same time he was burdened with the responsibility for guarding and protecting. So I began to feel, actually, there's a really intriguing story to tell
Wow,
here.
yeah.
And over a number of years, I went into it in some depth, while I was still pursuing economic and business and stories about wars and famines. I was also interested in this. And round about 1989, the same year that Lords of Poverty was published, I decided that I would do a book about Ethiopia's claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant. And that book was published in 1992, and it's called The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And
That was my next question:
yeah.
is why the sign and the seal? What are those things?
Well, part of your question was also that it's assumed to be a myth, that the question
Yeah.
of the loss of the ark is not properly understood. Actually, it turns out that there is a huge mystery surrounding the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant from ancient Israel.
Okay.
And doubly so because it was the single most important object of Old Testament times. That's why it's the sign and the seal, because it's the sign and the seal of God's presence on earth. That's what it's considered to be, nothing less than that. The Temple of Solomon is built in Jerusalem around 950 before Christ, specifically as an house of rest for the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord.
Really?
We know it stays there for hundreds of years afterwards. There are repeated accounts, but then round about 600s before Christ, the references become strange, and it sounds like they're mourning the loss of the Ark. And when the Babylonians invade Israel in 587 BC and steal everything from the temple, they don't find the Ark there. It's already gone by that point. And I mean, I have to cut a long story short here.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that the Ethiopian claim is extremely intriguing, because it turns out that a temple, a Jewish temple, exactly modeled on Solomon's temple, was built in Egypt, in Upper Egypt, near the modern city of Aswan, on an island called Elephantina, at exactly the time that we begin to get hints that the Ark has gone missing from Jerusalem. And my suggestion is that the Ark was taken out of Jerusalem because at that time there sat on the throne of Israel a king who was regarded as a heretic, and who had installed a pagan idol called an Asherah in the Holy of Holies of the temple. The loyal priests could never have allowed the Ark to stay in the presence of a pagan idol. I think they took it out, they took it to Egypt, they built a temple for it, they placed it there. 200 years later, and again, I'm cutting a long story very short, they were forced to flee from Egypt again. They couldn't flee north. They fled south. They followed the Nile River system. It brought them into Ethiopia around 400 before Christ. And there's extremely strong evidence that the Ark has been in Ethiopia ever since. And just the final part of the puzzle are the Ethiopian Jews, who are known as the Falashas, or the Beta Israel, the House of Israel. And they practice a pre-Talmudic, purely Old Testament form of Judaism. They don't have rabbis, they have priests. This is banned for the rest of Judaism. They do perform sacrifices supposed not to be done by the rest of Judaism. They have a very ancient Old Testament form of Judaism.
Wow.
And so they arrive. So I began to feel there's really a huge story to tell here. And that was the sign and the seal. And it led me then into a whole range of other historical mysteries. Just one
When you
thing.
say Solomon's Temple, what jumps out at me is in Freemasonry, they're always talking about the rebuilding of Solomon's Temple as an analogy for the building of the light body.
Yeah.
So if Solomon's Temple was where the Ark of the Covenant had been stored, then what is the relationship between that and Masonic lore and history?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, the Freemasons trace their origins back to Hiram Abiff, to the original builder, the architect of Solomon's Temple.
Right.
There's an extremely interesting track and line to follow there, and that line, curiously, through the Masons, leads us to the Knights Templar.
Right.
And that was also a feature of my study in the Sign and the Seal, because I found evidence that when the Knights Templar rose to power, and we're talking the late 1100s after Christ, that their primary mission in Jerusalem was not to protect pilgrims on the road between the coast and the city of Jerusalem, but actually to search for the Ark of the Covenant. They took possession of the Temple Mount, where the Temple of Solomon had stood until it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And they carried out excavations there. And then, again, too much detail to go into here, but I believe they encountered an Ethiopian prince exiled in Jerusalem called Lalibela, and returned to Ethiopia with him. And I found Templar crosses all over some of the sacred places of Ethiopia, an extraordinary group of churches at Lalibela, hewn out of solid rock, that I believe the Templars were involved in constructing. So somehow that Masonic Templar theme that goes right back to Solomon's Temple follows the Ark into Ethiopia as well.
Well, this can't just be, I mean, a skeptic could say, well, maybe they have this, maybe the stones are radioactive or something, but if you're describing this object, this gold and wooden object, levitating and lightning bolts shooting out of it, wouldn't it be that the radiation might be a side effect of some advanced technology that's inside?
I honestly believe if I were asked to place a bet on this, my bet would be that the Ark of the Covenant is an out of place artifact. It is a piece of technology. It's a piece of high technology. Now, I trace that back through the lineage of ancient Egypt. The objects like the Ark of the Covenant are found in other Egyptian traditions. And Moses, let's not forget that Moses, who's the guy who climbs Mount Sinai and receives the tablets of stone from God, and who is given the blueprint of the ark, which he then passes down to builders to make for him.
I see.
That Moses is reared in the household of the Pharaoh. He is groomed as a future Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, he breaks away from that, but to be groomed as a Pharaoh is no light thing. It means that Moses would have been a master of Egyptian magic. He would have known Hekau, everything that the Egyptians knew about magic. And I believe that incorporated into the ancient Egyptian system, it was, first of all, a powerful belief in magic and the powers of magic. Not superstition, but as a practical thing, a practical skill, a power that can be used in the world. And secondly, that this often manifested in the form of boxes, which were carried on poles, and which contained a powerful object, which radiated power. There are many, many examples of this that I go into in the book. And so I think the Ark is one of a category of objects that we can trace back in ancient Egypt. Now, the people who could build the pyramids, who could move gigantic blocks of stone weighing hundreds of tons as though they weighed no more than a feather, those ancient Egyptians clearly could do a lot of things that we can't do today.
Yeah.
And I think they had, where they got it from, I don't go there. I don't speculate. But I do argue that they were the masters of a sacred technology, a kind of magic, and that this was manifested in the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was taken out of that system and carried off to Israel, but it continued to be a powerful object.
I mean, it seems like if the Knight Templars are spending that much manpower and time and resources searching for this Ark, that they must have felt that if they had possession of it, that they would gain some really important capabilities by possessing it.
Yes, I think they absolutely did feel that.
So what might those capabilities be?
This is the power of God.
Defense system?
This is first and foremost within their system of ideas, and indeed within the system of ideas of the religion of Israel. This is the power of God. This is literally, you know, the sign and the seal of God's presence, as I say,
right.
and a manifestation of His power. So if you can direct and control divine power in some way, then you're the master of the universe. And I think that ultimately the Templars were seeking power, magical, divine power, through the Ark of the Covenant. I don't think they got it. I don't think it was ever brought back to Europe. I still think it's in Ethiopia. I think that the Ethiopian claim is stronger than any other. There are some loose traditions that the Ark is buried under the Temple Mount, that it's buried in a mountain in Jordan, but none of these are associated with a modern, ongoing, continuous tradition of veneration of the Ark of the Covenant. There's only one country in the world where the Ark is still venerated as a living object, and that is Ethiopia. And they've become masters of concealment. There are tunnels and systems underneath Aksum where the Ark can be carried away from any threat. The whole city is an armed camp, thousands of men with guns, and not to be taken lightly, because these are the men, the Tigrayans, who overthrew the dictatorship of Mengistu Haile Mariam. They're a powerful force, and the Ark is everything to them, and they protect it with their lives. But there are stories of escape routes, of tunnels, of places that the Ark can be taken out, and one very intriguing story from 1896, when the Italians invade Ethiopia. and the Italians were met by an Ethiopian force carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and the Italians were utterly defeated. It was the greatest ever defeat of a European by an African army in the whole history of the world.
No kidding.
And the Ethiopians also attribute that to the power of the Ark. So I think it's a very serious claim that they have.
So it has like a remote influencing ability, like it made them unable to fight somehow?
No, it strikes people dead.
Oh, really? Okay, so if the people that run it can direct their minds to...
Yes, there's a sacred lineage involved in running it, and you know, so these are the mysteries that I went into and explored. But
now, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, it's a silly movie on some level, but isn't that Nazis looking for this Ark of the Covenant?
That's Nazis looking for the Ark of the Covenant, and there is a story that I've been told by a number of eyewitnesses in Ethiopia that the Nazis, when later on in history, not in the 1890s, but the Italians came back in the 1930s, and they occupied Ethiopia for about 4 or 5 years, just before the Second World War and at the beginning of the Second World War. And there are accounts of Nazis with Italian troops coming to Axum and of the Ark being taken out through the tunnel system and hidden in a mountain and then brought back in when they came back. So, and the other thing I'll say about Raiders of the Lost Ark is, actually it's a pretty good film. And in terms of the extraordinary supernatural power that it shows the Ark possessing,
right,
that is in every sense literally correct to how it's described in the Bible. Exactly like that.
Wow.
So you know, this object and the traditions surrounding it came to intrigue me, and I wrote a major book about it, and it, again, this was the course of my life being switched in a different direction. I'd been a journalist, I'd been interested in economics and politics and all of that stuff, and a series of accidents led me to the Ark. The investigation of the Ark, in turn, brought other synchronicities and occurrences in my path that led me in further directions. For example, because Moses and his Egyptian background and the Egyptian background to the Ark is so important, I had to go to Egypt for the first time, and suddenly I found myself confronted by the pyramids and by the extraordinary mysteries of Egypt, and how Egypt just appears almost overnight, out of nowhere, in the Old Kingdom, just capable of doing almost anything. They
running water, sanitation,
and incredible architecture. Which you know, the architecture like that, it cannot be developed overnight. It requires a long tradition of skill, and yet that tradition is hidden from history. So, as my friend John Anthony West puts it, it looks like ancient Egyptian civilization was a legacy of something else.
Wow.
And that's when I began to consider the whole possibility of a lost civilization.
However, in 1904, a British archaeologist, Flinders Petrie, came across an Egyptian temple at Serabit el-Khadam, a short distance away, which was dated back to the time of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt.
Serabit el-Khadam was dated back to 2600 BC. Why was there a major ancient Egyptian temple so far away from Thebes, built on a remote mountaintop?
When Petrie excavated the site, he found evidence of furnaces, crucibles, and tools, as well as a large amount of white powder mixed with sand. This was clearly much more than just a temple. A place of science and worship? Could this possibly have been where the Ark of the Covenant was built? There's an Egyptian working in the Valley of the Kings who may have the answer. Ibrahim Mohammed Ali Rabe is the head of one of the oldest families in Gourna.
And there is few family.
His great-grandfather helped excavate in the Valley of the Kings, and his detailed knowledge of the area has been passed down through generations.
We live in the tombs of the noble here. The Gourna people, when they come, they used to live inside the tombs, and they start to build their houses outside the tombs. And we know there is, especially in the tombs of the noble, they have so much secret about power.
Working in the tombs of the nobles, which have been largely abandoned by modern archaeologists, Ibrahim has spent years analyzing the mummies and researching the burial rituals of the high priests. Controversially, he believes the ark may have been used to produce a very fine powdered gold known as mufst, or life, which he's found in many of the mummies of the nobles. He thinks the powder was produced by exposing the naturally mined gold to great heat inside or on the ark. And although there's no proof that this was the case, the scientific theory is possible.
Here used to be a stone door, has been locked and sealed and painted, so nobody knows. This is used to be a secret place for the powder jar. Here we are in a secret place where they used to put golden powder and the white powder inside jar. And this inside jar used to be in one of these small rooms here inside.
But the jars are broken, so someone stole what was inside.
Yeah, somebody broke them actually because they found them sealed. They don't know the secret.
Yeah.
They just broke them. Somebody's arm.
Oh my God.
See how big?
Wow.
And it's heavy because of all the medicine herb and the gold inside.
I know about this special white powder. There's been a lot of interest in the scientific community about it. They refer to it in the scientific community as monatomic elements.
Yeah.
It's white powder that is found in mining areas, and they analyze it and find that it contains gold, the salts of gold.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Science is in an interesting period right now. It's actually got to a stage where it's moving at a truly incredible rate. I mean, never before do I remember day-to-day discoveries. Week to week was something, month to month was pretty average, but day to day now, science is changing. Scientists say there's nothing that we're working on that seems to follow the rules and the laws that we were dealing with yesterday. New things are coming. So even the most notable researchers and scientists and writers in the mainstream frontliner are now sounding more like science fiction writers used to. And their work and their discoveries is in fact seeming a little preposterous to that breed of people whose vision is constrained perhaps by what they perceive to be the limits of plausible achievement. The people who feel that it was all learned, done and dusted with passing that last exam. Now it looks as simple as that. It looks just like a little white powder that on the face of it could be anything. That particular powder, not so long ago, was a sliver cut from a 24-carat Canadian maple leaf gold coin. So that gold powder is nothing but the atoms of gold. It's called asymmetrically deformed high spin. It's a high spin element because the way that the nucleus is shaped and the way that the electrons spin around it changes. And it's gold in a very shocked and frightened state that simply says, I don't know what I am anymore, I'll just fall apart. It would be the same whether it was atoms of platinum or any of those metals that are classified as noble, transition group metals, the science call them. The interesting thing about it is that within the space of time that it takes to transform a piece of gold into that, we move through analysis in a situation where here it tests as gold. Here, it doesn't matter what analysis you use. You can use spectroscopy, neutron activation, chemical analysis, whatever you like. It won't tell you it's gold. It is not gold anymore. It's a very strange and unique form of silica now. And this has caused a lot of interest in the scientific world. They've actually established now that those things which are the prize valuable metals are actually constructed of atoms that aren't metal. The only thing that is metallic are the bonds, the little gluons that hold the atoms together and form the solid. And once they've gone, the metal goes, the colour changes, the colour just disappears. this material has become enormously important. It's become important in terms of the medical industry, it's become important in terms of the power generative industry, it's become important in terms of fuel, and therefore it moves from the operating table of the local hospital into the spacecraft somewhere up there. This is a material of great magic. In today's world, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin in Texas has described these materials as exotic matter. It can think of no better way to explain them. They're exotic. They conform to no rules, and that they're not like anything else they've ever known. They are not on the periodic table of elements. Science has never known about them until the last few years. When Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark was first published, and that was 10 months ago, there were scientists claiming then that there was no such thing as monatomic gold. Well, that was their view then. These are some of the things that we get in today's scientific press. There is masses of this information, all about monatomic gold, about nanowires made from monatomic elements, and about their uses in various forms of technology, how important they are, how they can communicate with each other, how they resonate with DNA, how they will contain and attract energy. It can't reconfigure itself as metal. What it actually is little strings of atoms like the top picture there. They're called clusters or microclusters. Scientists are calling these wires now. They're really like DNA strands. They group together in little clusters like the bottom part of the picture and form these little clusters. So what we're seeing in the powder that we were just looking at, every grain of that powder is one of these clusters at the bottom. Little groupings of single atoms just hooked together, but not by anything metallic. The reason that these scientists hadn't heard about it a few months ago was that they weren't the scientists that were working on it. Scientists now are incredibly busy, busier than they've ever been before. They are so wrapped up in what they're doing and their new daily discoveries that the physicist in this room here wouldn't have a clue what the chemist is doing in his room down the corridor. Neither of them would know what the botanist is doing in the office across the road. So when these things come to them from other areas, they're surprised. It's new to them. The silly thing is that it doesn't take a lot to understand that whatever you're researching now in any of these fields, you have to keep abreast of what's going on in the other. And I make the point very often that even a little leaping insect, which is biology, knows that it's got to jump, which is physics, to feed, chemistry, on another plant, which is botany. So, you know, even the insect knows that the link between the sciences is very important. The amazing thing about these monatomic elements is that they're not actually a new discovery. We seem to have caught up with them again, but we seem to know about them a long, long time ago. We can go back to some very ancient texts. We can go back to Egypt, we can go back to Mesopotamia, we can go back even to the Bible itself and find lots and lots of ancient references to magical powders which actually seem to do all of the things that scientists are now telling us that these are capable of. It called these powders, which were associated gold in Mesopotamia, they were called shamana. In Egypt, they were called mufkut. So they had all these strange names. The Alexandrians called it the Paradise Stone. It's not a stone, it's a powder, but they called it the Paradise Stone. And in all cases, whether it was shamana, mufkut, Paradise Stone, or whatever, they all said this is a mysterious powder of projection. A powder of projection. And the various cultures were unanimous on that particular description. They said it has powers of levitation, powers of transmutation, of teleportation. It seemed to be a vehicle by which they would communicate with gods. It was something to do with the afterlife of the Egyptian pharaohs. And they also said it was a key to active longevity. Because of this, people were able to live a long time, particularly those whose life it was part of, the high priests, the kings, the pharaohs. The Egyptian pyramid texts, they talk about the material. It's called mufkut. The pyramid texts come from the 5th dynasty tomb at Saqqara of King Unas. Here is described something called the field of mufkuts, and this is interesting because this moves into modern science again, the field of mufkuts. This material was meant to have a field around it or about it, or that it was associated with, that was very magical and very powerful, and was the field in which the pharaohs would communicate with the gods. It was the field that determined their final gateway to the afterlife. The stories of this field turn up earlier than the 5th dynasty. They turn up in the 4th dynasty. They turn up in the 3rd and the 2nd. And it's very interesting that we've never discovered the bodies of any of those old kingdom pharaohs. We've discovered what we think might be their tombs, but we've never discovered their bodies or their mummies. Those that we've got are from a much later time. Somehow or other, they seem to have vanished into thin air. And the texts tell us they were sent into the field of mufkuts. Intriguing. This is a portion of an old Egyptian temple. There's an interesting story behind this temple. The anniversary of its discovery, the 100th anniversary, is next year. It was discovered in 1904, but it was not discovered in Egypt. Back in 1904, the Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie, British archaeologist, went on an expedition into the land of Sinai to map the country for the Egypt Exploration Fund. And that was the land apparently where Moses had taken the Israelites, and they'd crossed this land of Sinai to get from Egypt into the Promised Land. And en route there, they'd stopped at this amazing mountain. And this was the mountain where Moses saw the burning bush. It was where he received the 10 Commandments and the Book of the Law. It was where he seemingly spoke with God, and where they built the Ark of the Covenant. And this whole story is full of accounts of fires and all sorts of amazing magical things going on. Anyway, they decided to climb this mountain. They climbed it. 2,500 feet above ground level, they found a great plateau with this temple. An Egyptian temple in the middle of nowhere. 270 feet of it on this plateau. Another equal amount of it back inside a cave that was carved into the mountain. This thing was very important. At the time, they didn't know what they were looking for. They didn't know what they'd found, but they found a secreted hoard of pure, unadulterated white powder, which they said they winnowed and they sieved and they tested. There was nothing there, no residue of anything, just this amazing powder, which he said would disappear into your fingerprints. It was so fine. It seemed to have been an operative workshop, he said, more of a place of work than worship. The whole thing was dedicated, it seems, to mufkut and the production of mufkut. Every pharaoh from the 4th dynasty to the 19th dynasty was portrayed there. Every pharaoh had stated things that were written on tablets in this mountain. So these wall reliefs depict, going through the pharaohs of numerous dynasties, strange presentations. This is an example of one. This is drawn up by the Egypt Exploration Fund, this particular one from a relief. This is Pharaoh Amenhotep III. This is an 18th dynasty pharaoh, and the caption, these are all captioned in hieroglyphs. It says, Shebek Hotep brings the noble and precious stone to his majesty. He is the guardian who brings the bread, because he is the great one over the house of gold. So we have this, and we have this fellow here called Shebek Hotep, a treasurer fellow who's holding in the middle of the picture this cone-shaped object. So the association is there, and there are numerous of these. And once that had been discovered in this Sinai temple, the moment Egyptologists went back into Egypt and began to look, they kept finding these. Mufkut, cones, bread, light. It was about bread. It was about something the kings ingested. They were eating this material that was formed into little cakes, but it was a powder. The Old Testament book of Exodus gives us a really good example of this in operation. It took the longest time before anybody even thought to ask a question about this little bit of the story in Exodus. Many of you will know the story. Moses had been up the mountain. He'd come down with the Ten Commandments, and then he broke the tablets because he got terribly angry to see that his brother Aaron had collected all the gold earrings from the Israelites and melted them down and made a golden calf as an idol of worship. And he said, well, that may be the way we used to do things. We don't do that anymore. We have this new culture here that we're part of, and I've just spoken to the Lord of this culture, and we don't worship graven images anymore. And he got very angry. And then it says this, that he took the golden calf, he burnt it with fire, he transposed it with powder, mixed that with water, and fed it to the Israelites. Interesting little story. He took the gold, burnt it with fire, and transposed it into powder. That doesn't work. You heat gold with fire or burn gold with fire, you get molten gold. You don't get powder. Nobody, it seems, thought to ask the question. They use this, it says, to make bread. They could mix it with frankincense, the Bible tells us, and mold little bread cakes, which the most ancient Bible text that we have, the Septuagint, the old Greek Bible, calls bread of the presence, presumably bread of the presence of God or of something important. Shemanah means firestone. This is a relief from that temple, another relief showing a bread presentation again. It was always linked with bread. They were always little conical shapes. We know that from about 2,500 BC, the pharaohs in Egypt, or the kings before they became pharaohs in Greek times, were ingesting the bread cakes of this white powder substance. Only the metallurgical adepts knew the secret of its manufacture. Metallurgical adepts, yep, it's made from metal, that makes sense. The high priest of the temples had a very strange title. The high priests of the Egyptian temples were called the Great Artificers. Well, a great artificer is a worker in materials, particularly metals. So that was sort of interesting. It's beginning to link together, and thinking back to Petrie's concept, yeah, these were places of worship, not worship. Temples were not the same as churches, but evolved from the concept. I actually looked in just the English language word etymological dictionary from Oxford University. It traces the origin of words, and lo and behold, I only had to go back 700 years to discover that the word we now use as worship had a K in the middle of it. It was workship. They used to work for the gods. They didn't used to worship the gods. They used to work for the gods, whoever the gods were. It was said that this was the food of the light body. They said we all have bodies, but we don't just have physical bodies, we have light bodies. And just as we feed our physical bodies, they said, we have to feed our light bodies so that they will be nurtured and grow in the same way. They have to be as fulfilled as the physical body. And they call the light body the Ka. Well, it's interesting because scientists in recent times have actually called this material the light of life, because it resonates with DNA on the same frequencies. It's a light wave. We find lots of references to Mufkot. This relief here, this picture, this drawing was actually done by the Russian scholar Emanuel Velikovsky, and he drew this up simply to give us an image of this relief at Karnak, at the Temple of Karnak. This shows the treasures of the Pharaoh Thutmose the third. Mufkot in Egyptian law was always portrayed as a cone shape. Now these things sit there in the gold section, and it says underneath, these are gold, but we call them bread. 1450 BC, roughly, Thutmose founded at this temple at Karnak a college, an institute at the temple of scholarly, priestly types who were called the Great White Brotherhood. The Alexandrians wrote of them and said they were called the Great White Brotherhood because they were absolutely obsessed with a mysterious white powder. And they made some interesting comments. They said that they call it the Paradise Stone, And it has unique qualities in as much as that it can weigh far more than its own original quantity of gold. But even a feather can tip the scales against it. So it can be a lot heavier than the gold it came from, or it can be lighter than a feather. This stuff has the ability to change its weight very, very dramatically. It's always, in the old text, associated with light, with enlightenment, with illumination of some sort. It's a light illumination that seems to have to do with the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom, that sort of illumination and enlightenment. It's clear from the evidence of all these ancient things that it didn't matter what they called things. It didn't matter that they didn't understand perhaps the true science that we're beginning to understand now. What they did know is that it worked. It did certain things. And they told us about that. So even if they didn't understand it, they presented things as sort of communicating with gods and priests who were able to disappear before their very eyes and things. But these are all things that this enables to be done now. In Greek mythology, it was the one substance that sat right at the very heart of the Golden Fleece legend. It was what the quest was all about, the secrets of manufacture of this material. It's linked up with the Ark of the Covenant, that famous golden coffer that Moses had built at the mountain in Sinai and took to Jerusalem, where the temple was constructed to house it. So this most valuable artifact, the Ark of the Covenant, was entirely tied up with this science in some way, as we shall see. Mysterious processes concerning gold and things automatically ring alchemy bells. Pictures of wonderful wizened old chaps in medieval times with all sorts of potions and fires and things burning away, all trying to perfect this thing called the Philosopher's Stone, which Harry Potter has reminded us of yet again. It was in the middle 1600s, 1660, that Britain's Royal Society was founded and established and chartered by King Charles II, and it was that establishment of that society that embodied and led to the great discoveries of people like Christopher Wren, of Edmund Halley, of Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and all of these tremendous characters that emerged in the 1660s and 70s to make scientific discoveries that had never been made before. And most of those were made on the back of the fact that they were pursuing alchemy. They were searching for the Philosopher's Stone, and during the course of it they made lots of other discoveries. Just like today in space research we get for our households all sorts of other wonderful spin-offs. The discoveries of things like gravity and whatever were spin-offs from looking for the Philosopher's Stone. There was one particular fellow classified today as an alchemist, although he was simply called a philosopher at the time. He was truly revered as a great master by the Newtons and others of the day. This fellow was called Arrhenius Philalathus. And for Arrhenius Philalathus was reckoned to be the ultimate master in that period. And Philalathus had got a little bit fed up with the church propaganda about the Philosopher's Stone being some silly device to turn base elements into gold and whatever, and he thought he'd publish material and put the record straight in the public domain. So in 1667 in Amsterdam he had a work published called Secrets Revealed. And in this he discussed the Philosopher's Stone, its nature, its qualities, what they knew about it. But most important, he made this point. Our stone is nothing but gold. Our stone is nothing but gold. It's gold digested to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation. We call it a stone only because of its fixed nature, because it resists the action of fire as successfully as any stone. In species, it's more pure than any gold that it comes from, but its appearance is that of a very fine white powder. That was the Philosopher's Stone, straight from the hand of the most famous chemist, alchemist of his time. We go back 200 years, we go back to the 15th century. We can look at the last testament of Nicholas Flamel, probably the best known of all the great alchemists of all time. A fellow who spent 20 years from a very poor base studying his science and ended up probably as the greatest and wealthiest benefactor that France has ever known. He made the point on the 22nd of November 1416, when writing his last testament, exactly the same. Our stone is gold, but it's perfectly prepared gold. It's a fine powder of gold. That is our philosopher's stone. So we have a whole new perspective here. We have a perspective that says the philosopher's stone, despite all the propaganda, despite all the church has done to try and make it look silly, is not about turning anything into gold. It is gold. It's gold in the highest possible, purest form that it ever could be. And that white powder that we looked at earlier was exactly that. That was 24 karat gold. What's the gold that the philosopher's stone makes? The Great Enlightenment. Not the great enlightenment of money and wealth and riches and a lump of gold. The great enlightenment of wisdom and learning and intuition. That's the real Holy Grail. That's the true enlightenment. We can leap forward in time now and see how these old stories match up with what's been going on. And it begins right here in the United States. It begins in 1976, and it begins in Phoenix, Arizona. A very, very apt place, actually, because the word Phoenix was Old Phoenician and it means red gold. It all began with a farmer, a cotton farmer, a third-generation cotton farmer just outside Phoenix called David Hudson. This is a picture of David Hudson as he was about 5 years ago. He's your average American farmer. He wasn't a physicist, he wasn't a scientist, he was nothing. He certainly wasn't an alchemist. He was destined to become all of them. His father had been Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Arizona. They were farming about 70,000 acres in the Yuma Valley there, and they were growing cotton of very, very high grade. But they had a problem with their soil. Big problem with the soil. The soil was enormously alkaline. In fact, it's a strange soil there. There's no topsoil in it. There's no real nutrient as such that's apparent. It's just eroded rock dust. That's all it is. Very strange material. Its surface becomes very black and very crunchy, to the point where at the end of a growing season, once the crop's been picked, over the ensuing months, this stuff gets so hard that it will not be penetrated by water. Now, it's not an area where it rains a lot, but their irrigation trucks were having no use with it. And this had gone on for generations. And David thought, well, it's about time to have a look at this and to try and work out what this stuff is, because it means that we have to work in rotation, and we can only plant our crops in that field every 3 years. What they did to start with was that they take this substance, and they could see that it was a combination substance, some of which was just nasty black stuff, but within it there were these white elements that really seemed to show up within it, and they wanted to know what they were, because this seemed to be the thing that was the problem. So they took it into the lab, they cleaned it all up, they actually got this stuff out of the black material into a precipitate, and what they then had to do was to dry that out so that they could test it. Well, the strangest thing was happening. They decided the best way to dry it was simply to take the filter papers and put them out in the sunshine, just to put them outside. The moment they did that, it exploded. Now, it hadn't been that the farmland had been exploding, but the moment they separated this material and put it in the sun, something about the heat or the light exploded it. And it was explained as if it was like a flash of 40 or 50,000 flashbulbs all going off at once. Not only that, it disappeared. They thought, well, that's really strange. You know, is this an implosion or an explosion? What's going on here? It's like a great blast of this light. So they took an unsharpened pencil and just stood it on end in the sample, in the filter paper. Just stood it there. Bang, white light, it's gone. The pencil's still there. It hasn't blown over. It's not been affected by this. There's no blast. So they said, okay, this needs cleverer testing than we've got. So up they go to Cornell University. Now at Cornell at that time, they said that they got this amazing new equipment, and this equipment could test anything that you'd got down to 3 to 5 parts per billion. So they put it on their machines, and they came back and they said, it's iron and silica and aluminum. They said, well, it can't be. None of those things disappear in a blaze of white light. No, I mean, none of them have these properties. There must be more to it than that. So they tested them again, and they discovered that actually the reading that they were getting was just a little impurity at the front level. It was reaching the boiling point of these particular substances. And once they got rid of them, and they were less than 1% of the whole, once they got rid of them and tested 99% plus of the sample, they said, we can tell you exactly what you've got. Pure nothing. You have nothing that our machine will read. It will not acknowledge that there's anything on there being tested. It's nothing. So they said, okay, we'll try arc emission spectroscopy. Very, very simple process. 2 electrodes. The bottom one has a cup in it. You place your sample in the bottom cup. You bring the other one down and you strike an arc. That arc heats up and ionizes what's in the sample, and one by one, as it reaches the boiling temperatures of each of the constituent elements, it will read them off and tell you what's there. So if, for example, you put a motor car engine in there, its first reading would tell you it was water, because it was reading the cooling system. When the water had all boiled away, it would then tell you it was metal. So that's the way it works. So anyway, they put the stuff in there, and the same thing happened. They said it was iron, silica, and aluminum, and that was it. Nothing was recognizing it. It was not listed. It was totally unknown to science, this strange white material that would disappear from vision. Well, then the Russians came along. The Soviet Academy of Sciences. We're now into the 1980s, well into the 1980s, and the Russians said, we've been telling you guys in the West for the longest time, you really haven't got much of a clue when it comes to analyzing materials. Your electrodes burn away before you can reach the boiling temperature of some of your materials. Carbon has a lower boiling temperature. These electrodes are made of carbon. They're burning away before whatever it is has heated up enough. So it's not reading it. Russians said you need to burn this in an arc for 300 seconds, not 15, which was common in the West. 300, 5 minutes. So they go back to base and they put the material in, and it begins. Within 15 seconds, iron, silica, aluminum. They all expected that, and then it's nothing. But the arc now is carrying on burning, whereas the Western style one stopped. And suddenly, at 70 seconds, it says it's palladium. After palladium reads platinum. After that, as the various boiling temperatures were reached, came ruthenium, rhodium, iridium, and at 220 seconds, osmium. Every one of the platinum group metals was in this substance. It was them. It just wasn't showing up at them as them in a metallic way. And in fact, when they worked out the content of these soil samples, it was discovered that per ounces of substance per ton of soil, they had 7,500 times more platinum in every ton of their soil than they were getting from every ton in the best platinum mine in South Africa. But it wasn't metal. You couldn't make jewelry with it. Suddenly Hudson discovered that General Electric up in Massachusetts were looking at a new sort of fuel cell technology. And he said, look, I've got this stuff here, and it says in your literature that you're using rhodium and iridium and these platinum group metals for fuel cells. Your reports say that you're experiencing very strange phenomenon. You're experiencing blazing white lights and explosions and disappearing tricks and things. And they said, yeah. And he said, well, I've got some stuff that does that. And they said, yeah, don't worry about the white light explosions. We know all about those. Don't worry about the disappearing tricks. We know all about those. And he said, great, tell me all about them. And they said, no, I mean, we don't understand them. We just know about them. We know that it happens, and that's where we're leaving it. You know, it happens. We don't want to understand it. We want to make fuel cells. Well, David wanted to understand it. It was then decided that since this stuff was going to be proven as a kind of material that could be used in fuel cells, they said you ought to get down to the patent office and lodge a patent on this. You know, you need to lodge it because somebody else could discover it and stop you from working with it. So that's what he did. And there's a portion in the application where you have to do tests with weights and measures. Well, the funny thing about this material was that they'd noticed that its weight was fluctuating. So he said, well, like when? You know, at what stage do we weigh it? They said, well, you're just going to have to keep heating it and cooling it and heating it and cooling it and seeing what the mean weight is. So they got this machine, which is called a thermogravimetric analyzer, and they started doing this weighing. Well, it was actually quite remarkable. They managed to get readings during heating that took it to a weight of less than 0. They managed to get readings during cooling that took it to anything up to 700 times its original weight. Think of the Alexandrian Paradise Stone. These powders will outweigh the original quantity of gold. They can also be lighter than a feather. That was exactly what it was doing. But during the process, there was one particular moment in time where the weight fell very quickly and very dramatically at that moment, and it fell by 44% suddenly. But what they noticed was something really odd, because the less than 0 weight that they were getting didn't make a lot of sense. It was sitting there in a pan in the lab on effectively weighing equipment. The pan itself weighs something. You have to compensate for it before you put the other material in it. Well, what they discovered was that it was reading all of these 0 weights, below 0, but they thought, well, what about the pan? That should weigh something. So they tipped the material out and put the pan back, and it suddenly weighed more without the material in it than it did when it was in it. This stuff was not only levitating, it was carrying the pan with it. And they learned that this stuff has the power to give levitational qualities to its host. So they carried on and they thought, well, we've got to do these other things for the application. We've got to see if it's conductive. That was the next test they had to do. So they put wires and electrodes into it, attached them to a voltmeter, turned on the power, nothing. And then they thought, well, it's got to be a conductor of some sort, because if it's capable of holding energy, you know, how are General Electric doing it? You know, it has to be conductive. Anyway, it turned out that it was a superconductor rather than a conductor. Superconductors are very, very strange animals. They don't need contacts to convey to each other. They convey to each other through resonant frequencies, through lights. The interesting thing is that if you transmit electricity from A to B with a wire, you always get some dispersion. You always lose some energy. With this, you lose nothing. 100% can go from there to there, no contact in between, 100% stays. It works so differently because it doesn't allow voltage potential to exist within itself. Neither does it allow any magnetic field to exist within itself. It's totally null. It doesn't react to North Pole, South Pole. It has its own quality, and its own quality defines all the laws. Here we have a standard magnet. We have North and South Pole. It's the magnet we all use. It will attract metals. And in fact, even if you put above it something that it won't attract, it'll fall down onto it because gravity will just take it there. That superconductor doesn't. Wants nothing to do with it. Won't be attracted by it, won't particularly be repelled by it, but it's just placed there above it and it'll just stay wherever it's put. We know that its anti-gravity properties can be translated to its host. We know that the scale of that doesn't seem to matter. It's macrocosm, microcosm, big, small, has nothing to do with these superconductors. So in as much as that tons of it were discovered at this Egyptian temple, dating back to the 4th dynasty, at the time they were building the pyramids, and we know that this stuff was very capable of transferring its weightlessness to the pan in the lab or whatever else one might associate it with. It would be equally as capable of helping them move the most enormous stones to build pyramids, which incidentally the stones themselves contain. You don't even have to get them from outside. Sandstones and limestones contain these elements in a natural form. And it's very interesting to think now that of all of the ways that they thought perhaps these stones were moved, none of them have ever worked in experiment or trial. This does. So they discovered that this stuff would levitate. They discovered it would disappear. They didn't quite know why or where it went to. And they knew that it was important for energy. They knew that if it was a superconductor, it could attract energy, it could store energy, and it could distribute energy. Yeah, fuel cell, that's what we're looking at here. The old stories of the powder and the Ark of the Covenant began to ring bells here about this potential that they had the ability with the use of this material to store and distribute enormous quantities of energy. So Hudson got very, very, very excited about all this, and he went along to the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, and he met with the director there, a fellow called Hal Puthoff, who many of you might know or know of. And Hal Puthoff is famous for his studies of zero-point gravity and vacuum energy, that sort of thing. What Puthoff had established, he'd been working on gravity calculations by the Russian physicist Andrei Sakharov from the 60s, and he'd been working out the mathematics for this, and he'd worked out that matter was capable of resonating in different dimensions that weren't ours. But what he calculated mathematically from Sakharov's work was that the moment it begins to do that, at that moment, the moment you know it's on the change, just hooking into the beginnings of another dimension, it will automatically lose 4/9 of its weight. And Hudson went along, he said, look, this is really interesting because 44% mine's losing, and that's the same, it's the same figure, 4/9. And so they agreed, well, yeah, I mean, it's because this stuff is beginning to resonate in another dimension. That's what's happening to it. It should disappear totally, he was told, if it carries on, and he said, it does. Disappears totally. We don't know where it goes, it just disappears. So they decided to test this. And they said that, look, the way to do it is this. If you have a little pile of powder in a pan, and it becomes invisible, that means it's still there, but you can't see it. So if you've got a spatula and messed it up in the pan, it would come back, when it comes back, in a mess. But we suspect that yours won't. We suspect it will come back in the same shape that it disappeared in. And that's exactly what happened. It didn't come back in a mess. It came back looking exactly like it had disappeared, in that same perfect shape. There you are, they said. It's not invisible. It has simply moved out of our space-time, and it's now been brought back into it. What we've seen over the past 6 or 7 years now is an increasing awareness in the science press of the DNA links with these materials and how important they're becoming. They've talked about how they can be used to re-coordinate the uncontrolled division of body cells. This particular article here from Scientific American, the way it reads is this, that they place these elements at the end of the strands. The researchers examined the electrical properties of short lengths of double helix DNA in which there was a ruthenium atom at each end of one of the strands. Mead and Khayyam, the scientists, estimated from earlier studies that a short single strand of DNA ought to conduct up to 100 electrons a second. Imagine their astonishment when they measured the flow along the ruthenium-doped double helix to find that the current was up by a factor of more than 10,000 times. It was as if, they said, the double helix was behaving like a piece of molecular wire. Wow. It's our monatomic gold wires. They're able to turn the DNA into becoming a part of its structure, or vice versa. The two things can become one. By this means that they build up an integrated circuit of light within the body, and they have the ability to perform cell correction. In today's world, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin in Texas has described these materials as exotic matter. It can think of no better way to explain them. They're exotic. They conform to no rules, and they're not like anything else they've ever known. They are not on the periodic table of elements. Science has never known about them until the last few years. The Center for Advanced Study in Illinois classifies superconductivity, which is one of their main attributes, as the most remarkable property in the universe. We've got something pretty amazing here. We've got a very ordinary looking white powder which is exotic beyond any comparison and contains abilities which are the most remarkable properties in the universe. And yet it appears like some grains maybe of talcum powder. So as we sort of move towards rounding up here, manipulation of space-time has been something they've been talking about for about the last 5 to 7 years. A fellow here called Miguel Alcubierre. He's a Mexican mathematical scientist involved with the Max Planck Institute in Germany, was working at the time in 1994 for the University of Wales over in Britain. This is the abstract at the beginning of a multi-page document that he wrote, the journal Classical and Quantum Gravity, which caused quite a stir worldwide. He didn't pose any questions, he didn't say that this is what we're researching. He began his article with, "We now know." In fact, the abstract reads, "It is now known that it's possible to modify space-time in a way that allows a spaceship to travel at an arbitrarily large speed by a purely local expansion of the space-time behind the ship and an opposite contraction in front of it. A motion faster than the speed of light, reminiscent of the warp drive of science fiction." Well, we're back to the sort of questions that we have with the DNA and the strands. How do we solve our space travel problems? We know that people's lives can't last long enough to get to the distant stars. We know that our machinery and metals can't. We know that the fuel runs out. We know that these things are inordinate distances away. How do we deal with it? We deal with it laterally, as Alcubierre suggests. We think about it differently. We forget about the spacecraft. What do? We look at the spacecraft, we look at the million light years that it has to travel, and we know that that's impossible. So why don't we just take the million light years and put it behind the spacecraft? Why don't we think about that? Why not move the space-time instead of the craft, so that with zero propulsion and no time having gone by, it can move through a million light years because you've simply screwed that up, tossed it behind it, opened it up again, and it says, "It is now possible to modify space-time." Well, yes, it is. He was absolutely correct. It is now possible. This was followed in a series of related articles. American scientist, an article written by the physicist Michael Spear. He showed that this had nothing to do with violating Einstein's theory, the theory that nothing can travel faster than light. It didn't violate that at all because nothing would be traveling anywhere. It would be staying still. Space-time would be moving. The acceleration rate, he said, would be enormous in theory, but there wouldn't actually be any. The true acceleration would be zero. Fuel consumption, zero. Time taken, zero. Distance traveled, million light years, maybe. So the question was raised, okay, it's possible, how is it possible? What's the device that makes it possible? And the answer came back loud and clear, exotic matter will be needed to generate distortions of space-time. The next question that went back was, what is exotic matter? Exotic matter, here's the description, it has the curious property of having a negative energy density, unlike normal matter that we're familiar with that makes up the people and the planets and the stars, which has positive energy density. The necessary exotic device is an operative superconductor. And in fact, the list of what exotic matter is the same list of every attribute that applied from the research tests on monatomic superconductive elements. They're the only substance ever to have been classified as exotic matter. What's needed to generate distortions in space-time? Exotic matter. What does bending space-time mean? It means the ability to move from one dimension into another. What did this stuff prove that it can do? Move from one dimension into another and be brought back again. Nothing travels faster than light, they say, but we need to travel faster than light in order to make any headway. If traveling faster than light is impossible, the only alternative is to approach the problem from a different perspective. We must learn how to manipulate and distort space-time. The Ohio Aerospace Institute says that all of this is possible now because it's been recognized that space is just like any other matter. It has a form, it has a shape, it can be bent, it can be distorted. And how did they recognize that? Because when the white light explosions occurred, and 44% suddenly disappeared, it was a blaze of light, but light has no weight. So what was happening here? Light has no weight, it simply illuminates space-time. Oh, maybe it's the space-time that weighs 44%. Yes, it was. Space-time has weight. So what the ancients saying about the Shemana and the Mufkut? It was all the same thing. Every description of these substances was always the same. We think about the Bible story, we think about how we can make monatomic elements now. We need electronic devices, we need fire, we need all sorts of things. But we need electricity. In one way or another, we need electricity. And this is the one bit of the equation that has to be got through very quickly, because this is our last remnant, we think, about electricity. How are we going to produce electricity to manufacture our fuel cells if we don't have the fossil fuels to have our power stations? We get electricity from its most natural source, which is around us all the time. What we need is a device that will attract electricity, that will store electricity, that will discharge electricity in a very controllable form, in enormous quantities. However, we need to do it. That's all the Ark of the Covenant ever did and all it ever was. If you look at the construction of the Ark of the Covenant, it is no more than a model for every capacitor made today, whether it's a capacitor for lighting up street lighting or whatever. An insulated, double-plated box with a positive and a negative node at the top. That's it, that's all it is. And you look at the description of the Ark of the Covenant in the Bible, which is given twice. You take every measurement, you manufacture it with the materials that it says in accordance with everything it tells you, and you have a 100,000 volt immediate electronic capacitor.
Although the Bible does say it was lined inside and out with pure gold, the team estimated it would cost more than $10 million, not to mention the weight.
If it had a 9-inch slab of gold on top, which is 8, 9, whatever, if it had a solid slab of gold that was 3 feet by 5 feet, plus the box, plus all the other gold, plus the cherubims, it would have to be close to 2 tons.
How many guys did they say carried it?
4. That's what, I believe people were a lot stronger back then, but 2 tons?
To turn this wooden box into a capacitor, they're putting 2 layers of copper plates inside the box, separated by a large sheet of insulation material.
Each layer would be 1 plate of the capacitor. And when it's charged, one would develop a positive charge, one would develop a negative charge. And the energy would actually be stored in the insulator as a static electricity.
The 2 brass cherubs are attached to metal rods which lead down into the box. The team believes the Ark charged itself when it was carried through the desert for weeks on end. They think the heat and the friction would have built up a huge charge inside the box. To replicate this, Johns attached the Ark to a powerful transformer, which will provide 50,000 volts of electricity. If his calculations are correct, the copper chamber inside the box will charge up and then spark between the wings of the 2 cherubim.
I think they'll actually put on quite a light show.
You don't want to touch it. Definitely do not want to go anywhere within feet of it, really, when it's arcing.
This power is the primary energy here, here, through here. Cables again. Okay, he's connected. Why have I got this here?
Anything can happen, I guess.
So you're not concerned then?
Well, that'd be fun. What the hell? Why not? You only live once, right?
Let her rip.
High tension, high voltage, 50,000 volts. Blast and clear.
The experiment did seem to be a success. The ark did charge up like a capacitor, and the cherubim did spark between their wings before bursting into flames. Even in a warehouse in Vancouver, it's easy to see how people saw this as God in a box 3,000 years ago.
You do what the Bible says, and you place an omer of the Shemanah in it, golden part of the white powder, you place it in there, you've immediately got a superconductor. You've immediately got a device that sets up its own Meissner field, which will levitate, which will be able to travel on its own, which will be able to issue gamma rays or whatever you need it to do. A very, very powerful device. We have to go back to these very simple devices that simply pull it in and hold it and issue it. The Ark of the Covenant is not wrongly named. It's spelt with a K in the Bible because that was the Greek way of spelling it. In every other language it's spelt with a C, and electronic arcing actually comes from that very same word.
What do you think would happen if the Ark was to be rediscovered today? What would the political ramifications be?
I've had reason to think about this recently. It's just a fact, and it's a rather spooky one, that the three mainstream monotheistic faiths, Islam, particularly in its Shia manifestation, Judaism and Christianity, all have fundamentalist elements which all make reference to the Ark of the Covenant. For the character that the Shias call the hidden imam to return, and he by the way is the person whose return Iran is actively preparing for now, the Mahdi, whose name lies behind the name of the Mahdi army in Iraq. The hidden imam, the Mahdi, must recover the Ark of the Covenant and return it to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem before he can engage in what is seen in Shia tradition as the final battle of good against evil, which is interpreted in Iran as the battle of Shia Islam against the forces of the West and Judaism.
Right.
The Ark of the Covenant is the recovery and retrieval of the Ark of the Covenant, and its return to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the key that turns that process on, the process of Judgment Day or of the end of the world. It's the same for fundamentalist Judaism. There are groups such as, for example, the Temple Mount faithful in Israel, who are intent on building the third temple on the Temple Mount, and who would like to sweep away the monuments of Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and make it a site of fundamentalist Zionism. They too require the Ark of the Covenant in order to realize that apocalyptic dream, which they too see as the precursor to the end of the world.
Yeah.
And fundamentalist Christians make reference to the Book of Revelation, where one of the signs of the Day of Judgment is the reappearance and return of the Ark of the Covenant. So actually, in a weird kind of way, this ancient object that disappeared from the human story some 2,600 years ago, were it to be recovered today, could become a catalyst for some of the most extreme and ghastly apocalyptic visions that it's possible to imagine, and would undoubtedly be used as such by any one of those three groups that I've mentioned, whether I speak of fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Jews, or fundamentalist Muslims. For all of them, the access and control of that object would undoubtedly be used as a catalyst for a cataclysmic struggle. So I think it's really a good thing if the Ark just stays away from history for a while. It's interesting that the Ethiopians say that the Ark came to Ethiopia because God wanted it to be there, and that it's there to be hidden away, and it needs to be hidden away, and that they've been entrusted with keeping it hidden. And in an odd kind of way, that's the best thing they could do for the world, is to keep the Ark hidden and not return it into public discourse again. Just as it's impossible to understand ancient civilizations without getting into astronomy, I think it's impossible to understand ancient civilizations without getting into altered states of consciousness, which can be brought about by a variety of different means, of which the most widely used and the most reliably effective are the visionary plants. But there are other techniques and methods for getting into deeply altered states of consciousness. And Terence McKenna has, I think, done more than, and I really want to pay tribute to that courageous and brilliant psychonaut, that incredibly gifted speaker, that gift from the universe to mankind that was Terence McKenna, who, you know, we've sadly lost, but who just brought contact with these realms to levels that everybody can understand through his incredible, his voice, his ability to express verbally the unexpressible. I think is better than anybody that I know. And the next step to human freedom is to move forward to societies that will allow and nurture the exploration of altered states of consciousness, rather as Aldous Huxley envisaged in his amazing novel Island. Where this is understood to be a vital rite of passage, and where experiences can be had that can profoundly and positively affect the entire rest of our lives. It would perhaps allow the next step of evolution in human behavior, just as I believe it did 40,000 years ago when our ancestors started experimenting with these plants and entered suddenly into the realm of symbolism and art and spiritual beliefs. We too have got locked into a rigid technological framework. We're very good at technology, we have lots of different technologies, but we are still on a rigid path. And that path is proving to be self-destructive, and we need to step out of it. And these ancient plants are there to help us to do that. And we shouldn't fear that as a society. We should embrace it and responsibly use it to move us forward to the next stage.